There was no longer any doubt possible on the subject. The terrible fall had begun. The projectile had retained velocity enough not only to carry it beyond the dead point, but it was even able to completely overcome the feeble resistance offered by the rockets. It was all clear now. The same velocity that had carried the projectile beyond the neutral point on its way to the moon was still swaying it on its return to the Earth. A well-known law of motion required that, in the path which it was now about to describe, it should repass, on its return, through all the points through which it had already passed during its departure. No wonder that our friends were struck almost senseless when the fearful fall they were now about to encounter flashed upon them in all its horror. They were to fall a clear distance of nearly 200,000 miles. To lighten or counteract such a descent, the most powerful springs, checks, rockets, screens, deadeners, even if the whole Earth were engaged in their construction, would produce no more effect than so many spiderwebs. According to a simple law in ballistics, the projectile was to strike the Earth with a velocity equal to that by which it had been animated when issuing from the mouth of the Columbiad, a velocity of at least 7 miles a second. To have even a faint idea of this enormous velocity, let us make a little comparison. A body falling from the summit of a steeple, 150 feet high, dashes against the pavement with a velocity of 55 miles an hour. Falling from the summit of St. Peter's, it strikes the Earth at the rate of 300 miles an hour, or 5 times quicker than the rapidest express train. Falling from the neutral point, the projectile should strike the Earth with a velocity of more than 25,000 miles an hour. "We are lost," said 1000 Nicholl gloomily, his philosophy yielding to despair. "One consolation, boys," cried Arden, genial to the last, "we shall die together." "If we die," said Barbicane calmly, but with a kind of suppressed enthusiasm, "it will be only to remove to a more extended sphere of our investigations. In the other world, we can pursue our inquiries under far more favorable auspices. There the wonders of our great Creator, clothed in brighter light, shall be brought within a shorter range. We shall require no machine, nor projectile, nor material contrivance of any kind to be enabled to contemplate them in all their grandeur, and to appreciate them fully and intelligently. Our souls, enlightened by the emanations of the eternal wisdom, shall revel forever in the blessed rays of eternal knowledge." "A grand view to take of it, dear friend Barbicane," replied Arden, "and a consoling one too. The privilege of roaming at will through God's great universe should make ample amends for missing the moon." 1000 Nicholl fixed his eyes on Barbicane admiringly, feebly muttering with hardly moving lips, "Grit to the marrow, grit to the marrow." Barbicane, head bowed in reverence, arms folded across his breast, meekly and uncomplainingly uttered with sublime resignation, "Thy will be done." "Amen," answered his companions in a loud and fervent whisper. They were soon falling through the boundless regions of space with inconceivable rapidity. Chapter 20. Off the Pacific coast. "Well, Lieutenant, how goes the sounding?" "Pretty lively, Captain, we're nearly through," replied the lieutenant, "but it's a tremendous depth so near land. We can't be more than 250 miles from the California coast." "The depression certainly is far deeper than I had expected," observed Captain Bloomsbury. "We have probably lit on a submarine valley channeled out by the Japanese current." "The Japanese current, Captain?" "Certainly, that branch of it which breaks on the western shores of North America and then flows southeast towards the Isthmus of Panama." "That may account for it, Captain," replied young Brownson. "At least I hope it does, for then we may expect the valley to get shallower as we leave the land. So far, there's no sign of a telegraphic plateau in this quarter of the globe." "Probably not, Brownson. How is the line now?" "We have paid out 3,500 fathoms already, Captain, but, judging from the rate the reel goes at, we are still some distance from bottom." As he spoke, he pointed to a tall derrick temporarily rigged up at the stern of the vessel for the purpose of working the sounding apparatus, and surrounded by a group of busy men. Through a block pulley strongly lashed to the derrick, a stout cord of the best Italian hemp, wound off a large reel placed amidships, was now running rapidly and with a slight whirring noise. "I hope it's not the cup lead you are using, Brownson," said the captain after a few minutes' observation. "Oh no, Captain, certainly not," replied the lieutenant. "It's only Brooke's apparatus that is of any use in such depths." "Clever fellow that Brooke," observed the captain, "served with him under Maury. His detachment of the weight is really the starting point for every new improvement in sounding gear. The English, the French, and even our own are nothing but modifications of that fundamental principle. Exceedingly clever fellow. Bartham, sang out one of the men standing near the derrick and watching the operations. The captain and the lieutenant immediately advanced to question him. "What's the depth, Coleman?" asked the lieutenant. 21,762 feet, was the prompt reply, which Brownson immediately inscribed in his notebook, handing a duplicate to the captain. "All right, Lieutenant," observed the captain, after a moment's inspection of the figures. "While I enter it in the log, you haul the line aboard. To do so, I need hardly remind you, is a task involving care and patience. In spite of all our gallant little donkey engine can do, it's a 6 hours job at least. Meanwhile, the chief engineer had better give orders for firing up, so that we may be ready to start as soon as you're through. It's now close on to 4 bells, and with your permission I shall turn in. Let me be called at 3. Good night." "Good night, Captain," replied Brownson, who spent the next 2 hours pacing backward and forward on the quarter-deck, watching the hauling in of the sounding line, and occasionally casting a glance towards all quarters of the sky. It was a glorious night. The innumerable stars glittered with the brilliancy of the purest gems. The ship, hove to in order to take the soundings, swung gently on the faintly heaving ocean breast. You felt you were in a tropical clime, for though no breath fanned your cheek, your senses easily detected the delicious odor of a distant garden of sweet roses. The sea sparkled with phosphorescence. Not a sound was heard except the panting of the hard-worked little donkey engine and the whir of the line as it came up taut and dripping from the ocean depths. The lamp, hanging from the mast, threw a bright glare on deck, presenting the strongest contrast with the black shadows, firm and motionless as marble. The 11th day of December was now near its last hour. The steamer was the Susquehanna, a screw of the United States Navy, 4,000 in tonnage and carrying 20 guns. She had been detached to take soundings between the Pacific coast and the Sandwich Islands, the initiatory movement towards laying down an ocean cable, which the Pacific Cable Company contemplated finally extending to China. She lay just now a few hundred miles directly south of San Diego, an old Spanish town in southwestern California, and the point which is expected to be the terminus of the Great Texas and Pacific Railroad. The captain, John Bloomsbury by name, but better known as High-Low Jack from his great love of that game, the only one he was ever known to play, was a near relation of our old friend Colonel Bloomsbury of the Baltimore Gun Club. Of a good Kentucky family and educated at Annapolis, he had passed his meridian without ever being heard of, when suddenly the news that he had run the gauntlet in a little gunboat past the terrible batteries of Island No. 10, amidst a perfect storm of shell, grape and canister discharged at less than 100 yards distance, burst on the American nation on the 6th of April, 1862, and inscribed his name at once in deep characters on the list of the giants of the Great War. But war had never been his vocation. With the return of peace, he had sought and obtained employment on the Western Coast Survey, where everything he did he looked on as a labor of love. The sounding expedition he had particularly coveted, and once entered upon it, he discharged his duties with characteristic energy. He could not have had more favorable weather than the present for a successful performance of the nice and delicate investigations of sounding. His vessel had even been fortunate enough to have lain altogether out of the track of the terrible windstorm already alluded to, which, starting from somewhere southwest of the Sierra Madre, had swept away every vestige of mist from the summits of the Rocky Mountains, and by revealing the moon in all her splendor, had enabled Belfast to send the famous dispatch announcing that he had seen the projectile. Every feature of the expedition was, in fact, advancing so favorably that the captain expected to be able in a month or two to submit to the P.C. Company a most satisfactory report of his labors. Cyrus W. Field, the life and soul of the whole enterprise, flushed with honors still in full bloom, the Atlantic telegraph cable having been just laid, could congratulate himself with good reason on having found a treasure in the captain. High-Low Jack was the congenial spirit by whose active and intelligent aid he promised himself the pleasure of seeing before long the whole Pacific Ocean, covered with a vast reticulation of electric cables. The practical part, therefore, being in such safe hands, Mr. Field could remain with a quiet conscience in Washington, New York, or London, seeing after the financial part of the grand undertaking, worthy of the 19th century, worthy of the great republic, and eminently worthy of the illustrious Cyrus W. himself. As already mentioned, the Susquehanna lay a few hundred miles south of San Diego, or to be more accurate in 27 degrees 7, north latitude and degrees 37, west longitude, Greenwich. It was now a little past midnight. The moon in her last quarter was just beginning to peep over the eastern horizon. Lieutenant Brownson, leaving the quarter deck, had gone to the forecastle, where he found a crowd of officers talking together earnestly and directing their glasses towards her disk. Even here, out on the ocean, the Queen of the Night was as great an object of attraction as on the North American continent generally, where that very night and that very hour, at least 40 million pairs of eyes were anxiously gazing at her, apparently forgetful that even the very best of their glasses could no more see the projectile than angulate Sirius. The officers held them fast to their eyes for 5 minutes at a time, and then took them away only to talk with remarkable fluency on what they had not discovered. "Any sign of them yet, gentlemen?" asked Brownson gaily as he joined the group. "It's now pretty near time for them to put in an appearance. They're gone 10 days, I should think." "They're there, Lieutenant, not a doubt of it," cried a young midshipman, fresh from Annapolis and of course thoroughly posted in the latest revelations of astronomy. "I feel as certain of their being there as I am of our being here on the forecastle of the Susquehanna." "I must agree with you, of course, Mr. Midshipman," replied Brownson with a slight smile. "I have no grounds whatever for contradicting you." "Neither have I," observed another officer, the surgeon of the vessel. "The projectile was to have reached the moon when at her full, which was at midnight on the 5th. Today was the 11th. This gives them 6 days of clear light, time enough in all conscience not only to land safely but to install themselves quite comfortably in their new home. In fact, I see them there already." "In my mind's eye, Horatio," laughed one of the group. "Though the Doc wears glasses, he can see more than any 10 men on board." "Already," pursued the doctor, heedless of the interruption, "seen a stony valley near a selenite stream, the projectile on the right, half buried in volcanic scoriae, but apparently not much the worse for the wear. Ring mountains, craters, sharp peaks, etc. all around. Old Mac discovered taking observations with his leveling staff. Barbicane perched on the summit of a sharp-pointed rock, writing up his notebook. Arden, eyeglass on nose, hat under arm, legs apart, puffing at his imperador like a... Mac discovered taking observations. Mac discovered taking observations. A locomotive," interrupted the young midshipman, his excitable imagination so far getting the better of him as to make him forget his manners. He had just finished Locke's famous moon hoax, and his brain was still full of its pictures. "In the background," he went on, "can be seen thousands of Vespertilians, homines or man-bats, in all the various attitudes of curiosity, alarm, or consternation, some of them peeping around the rocks, some fluttering from peak to peak, all gibbering a language more or less resembling the notes of birds. Enter Lunatico, king of the Selenites." "Excuse us, Mr. Midshipman," interrupted Brownson with an easy smile. "Locke's authority may have great weight among the young middies at Annapolis, but it does not rank very high at present in the estimation of practical scientists." This rebuff administered to the conceited little midshipman, a rebuff which the doctor particularly relished, Brownson continued, "Gentlemen, we certainly know nothing whatever regarding our friend's fate. Guessing gives no information. How we ever are to hear from the moon until we are connected with it by a lunar cable, I can't even imagine. The probability is that we shall never." "Excuse me, Lieutenant," interrupted the unrebuffed little midshipman, "can't Barbicane write?" A shout of derisive comments greeted this question. "Certainly he can write and send his letter by the Pony Express," cried one. "A postal card would be cheaper," cried another. "The New York Herald will send a reporter after it," was the exclamation of a third. "Keep cool, just keep cool, gentlemen," persisted the little midshipman, not in the least abashed by the uproarious hilarity excited by his remarks. "I asked if Barbicane couldn't write. In that question I see nothing whatever to laugh at. Can't a man write without being obliged to send his letters?" "This is all nonsense," said the doctor. "What's the use of a man writing to you if he can't send you what he writes?" "What's the use of his sending it to you if he can have it read without that trouble?" answered the little midshipman in a confident tone. "Is there not a telescope at Long's Peak? Doesn't it bring the moon within a few miles of the Rocky Mountains and enable us to see on her surface objects as small as 9 feet in diameter? Well, what's to prevent Barbicane and his friends from constructing a gigantic alphabet? If they write words of even a few hundred yards and sentences a mile or two long, what is to prevent us from reading them? Catch the idea now, eh?" They did catch the idea, and heartily applauded the little middy for his smartness. Even the doctor saw a certain kind of merit in it, and Brownson acknowledged it to be quite feasible. In fact, expanding on it, the lieutenant assured his hearers that, by means of large parabolic reflectors, luminous groups of rays could be dispatched from the Earth, of sufficient brightness to establish direct communication even with Venus or Mars, where these rays would be quite as visible as the planet Neptune is from the Earth. He even added that those brilliant points of light, which have been quite frequently observed in Mars and Venus, are perhaps signals made to the Earth by the inhabitants of these planets. He concluded, however, by observing that, though we might by these means succeed in obtaining news from the moon, we could not possibly send any intelligence back in return, unless indeed the Selenites had at their disposal optical instruments at least as good as ours. All agreed that this was very true, and as is generally the case when one keeps all the talk to himself, the conversation now assumed so serious a turn that for some time it was hardly worth recording. At last the chief engineer, excited by some remark that had been made, observed with much earnestness, "You may say what you please, gentlemen, but I would willingly give my last dollar to know what has become of those brave men. Have they done anything? Have they seen anything? I hope they have, but I should dearly like to know. Ever so little success would warrant a repetition of the great experiment. The Columbiad is still to the good in Florida, as it will be for many a long day. There are millions of men today as curious as I am upon the subject. Therefore it will be only a question of mere powder and bullets if a cargo of visitors is not sent to the moon every time she passes our zenith." "Marston would be one of the first of them," observed Brownson, lighting his cigar. "Oh, he would have plenty of company," cried the midshipman. "I should be delighted to go if he'd only take me." "No doubt you would, Mr. Midshipman," said Brownson. "The wise men, you know, are not all dead yet." "Nor the fools either, Lieutenant," growled old Frisbee, the fourth officer, getting tired of the conversation. "There is no question at all about it," observed another. "Every time a projectile started it would take off as many as it could carry." "I wish it would only start often enough to improve the breed," growled old Frisbee. "I have no doubt whatever," added the chief engineer, "that the thing would get so fashionable at last that half the inhabitants of the Earth would take a trip to the moon." "I should limit that privilege strictly to some of our friends in Washington," said old Frisbee, whose temper had been soured probably by a neglect to recognize his long services, "and most of them I should by all means insist on sending to the moon. Every month I would ram a whole raft of them into the Columbiad, with a charge under them strong enough to blow them all to the— but hey, what in creation's that?" For a second only did they catch its flash. Whilst the officer was speaking, his companions had suddenly caught a sound in the air which reminded them immediately of the whistling scream of a Lancaster shell. At first they thought the steam was escaping somewhere, but looking upwards, they saw that the strange noise proceeded from a ball of dazzling brightness, directly over their heads, and evidently falling towards them with tremendous velocity. Too frightened to say a word, they could only see that in its light the whole ship blazed like fireworks, and the whole sea glittered like a silver lake. Quicker than tongue can utter or mind can conceive, it flashed before their eyes for a second, an enormous bolide set on fire by friction with the atmosphere, and gleaming in its white heat like a stream of molten iron gushing straight from the furnace. For a second only did they catch its flash before their eyes, then striking the bowsprit of the vessel which it shivered into 1,000 pieces, it vanished in the sea in an instant with a hiss, a scream, and a roar, all equally indescribable. For some time the utmost confusion reigned on deck, with eyes too dazzled to see, ears still ringing with the frightful combination of unearthly sounds, faces splashed with floods of sea water, and noses stifled with clouds of scalding steam. The crew of the Susquehanna could hardly realize that their marvelous escape by a few feet from instant and certain destruction was an accomplished fact, not a frightful dream. They were still engaged in trying to open their eyes and to get the hot water out of their ears, when they suddenly heard the trumpet voice of Captain Bloomsbury crying, as he stood half-dressed on the head of the cabin stairs, "What's up, gentlemen? In heaven's name, what's up?" The little midshipman had been knocked flat by the concussion and stunned by the uproar, but before anybody else could reply, his voice was heard, clear and sharp, piercing the din like an arrow. "It's they, Captain, didn't I tell you so?" Chapter 21. News for Marston. In a few minutes, consciousness had restored order on board the Susquehanna, but the excitement was as great as ever. They had escaped by a hairsbreadth the terrible fate of being both burned and drowned without a moment's warning, without a single soul being left alive to tell the fatal tale. But on this neither officer nor man appeared to bestow the slightest thought. They were wholly engrossed with the terrible catastrophe that had befallen the famous adventurers. What was the loss of the Susquehanna and all it contained, in comparison to the loss experienced by the world at large in the terrible tragic denouement just witnessed? The worst had now come to the worst. At last the long agony was over forever. Those three gallant men, who had not only conceived but had actually executed the grandest and most daring enterprise of ancient or modern times, had paid by the most fearful of deaths, for their sublime devotion to science and their unselfish desire to extend the bounds of human knowledge. Before such a reflection as this, all other considerations were at once reduced to proportions of the most absolute insignificance. But was the death of the adventurers so very certain after all? Hope is hard to kill. Consciousness had brought reflection, reflection doubt, and doubt had resuscitated hope. "It's they," had exclaimed the little midshipman, and the cry had thrilled every heart on board as with an electric shock. Everybody had instantly understood it. Everybody had felt it to be true. Nothing could be more certain than that the meteor which had just flashed before their eyes was the famous projectile of the Baltimore Gun Club. Nothing could be truer than that it contained the three world-renowned men, and that it now lay in the black depths of the Pacific Ocean. But here opinions began to diverge. Some courageous breasts soon refused to accept the prevalent idea. "They're killed by the shark," cried the crowd. "Killed," exclaimed the hopeful ones, "not a bit of it. The water here is deep enough to break a fall twice as great." "They're smothered for want of air," exclaimed the crowd. "Their stock may not be run out yet," was the ready reply. "Their air apparatus is still on hand." "They're burned to a cinder," shrieked the crowd. "They had not time to be burned," answered the band of hope. "The projectile did not get hot till it reached the atmosphere, through which it tore in a few seconds." "If they're neither burned nor smothered nor killed by the shark, they're sure to be drowned," persisted the crowd with redoubled lamentations. "Fish 'em up first," cried the hopeful band. "Come, let's lose no time, let's fish 'em up at once." The cries of hope prevailed. The unanimous opinion of a council of the officers hastily summoned together by the captain was to go to work and fish up the projectile with the least possible delay. But was such an operation possible? Asked a doubter. "Yes," was the overwhelming reply. "Difficult, no doubt, but still quite possible." Certainly, however, such an attempt was not immediately possible, as the Susquehanna had no machinery strong enough or suitable enough for a piece of work involving such a nicety of detailed operations, not to speak of its exceeding difficulty. The next unanimous decision, therefore, was to start the vessel at once for the nearest port, whence they could instantly telegraph the projectile's arrival to the Baltimore Gun Club. But what was the nearest port? A serious question, to answer which in a satisfactory manner the captain had to carefully examine his sailing charts. The neighboring shores of the California peninsula, low and sandy, were absolutely destitute of good harbors. San Diego, about a day's sail directly north, possessed an excellent harbor, but not yet having telegraphic communication with the rest of the Union, it was of course not to be thought of. San Pedro Bay was too open to be approached in winter. The Santa Barbara Channel was liable to the same objection, not to mention the trouble often caused by kelp and wintry fogs. The Bay of San Luis Obispo was still worse in every respect. Having no islands to act as a breakwater, landing there in winter was often impossible. The harbor of the picturesque old town of Monterey was safe enough, but some uncertainty regarding shore telegraphic communications with San Francisco decided the council not to venture it. Half Moon Bay, a little to the north, would be just as risky, and in moments like the present when every minute was worth a day, no risk involving the slightest loss of time could be ventured. Evidently, therefore, the most advisable plan was to sail directly for the Bay of San Francisco, the Golden Gate, the finest harbor on the Pacific coast and one of the safest in the world. Here telegraphic communication with all parts of the Union was assured beyond a doubt. San Francisco, about 750 miles distant, the Susquehanna could probably make in 3 days, with a little increased pressure, possibly in 2 days and a half. The sooner then she started, the better. The fires were soon in full blast. The vessel could get under way at once. In fact, nothing delayed immediate departure but the consideration that 2 miles of sounding line was still to be hauled up from the ocean depths. Rutt, the captain, after a moment's thought, unwilling that any more time should be lost, determined to cut it. Then, marking its position by fastening its end to a buoy, he could haul it up at his leisure on his return. "Besides," said he, "the buoy will show us the precise spot where the projectile fell." "As for that, Captain," observed Brownson, "the exact spot has been carefully recorded already. 27 degrees 7 north latitude by 41 degrees 37 west longitude, reckoning from the meridian of Washington." "All right, Lieutenant," said the captain curtly, "cut the line." A large cone-shaped metal buoy, strengthened still further by a couple of stout spars to which it was securely lashed, was soon rigged up on deck, whence, being hoisted overboard, the whole apparatus was carefully lowered to the surface of the sea by means of a ring in the small end of the buoy. The latter was then solidly attached to the part of the sounding line that still remained in the water, and all possible precautions were taken to diminish the danger of friction, caused by the contrary currents, tidal waves, and the ordinary heaving swells of ocean. It was now a little after 3 o'clock in the morning. The chief engineer announced everything to be in perfect readiness for starting. The captain gave the signal, directing the pilot to steer straight for San Francisco, north-north by west. The waters under the stern began to boil and foam. The ship very soon felt and yielded to the power that animated her, and in a few minutes she was making at least 12 knots an hour. Her sailing powers were somewhat higher than this, but it was necessary to be careful in the neighborhood of such a dangerous coast as that of California. 750 miles of smooth waters presented no very difficult task to a fast traveler like the Susquehanna, yet it was not till 2 days and a half afterwards that she sighted the Golden Gate. As usual, the coast was foggy. Neither Point Lobos nor Point Bonta could be seen, but Captain Bloomsbury, well acquainted with every portion of this coast, ran as close along the southern shore as he dared, the fog gun at Point Bonta safely directing his course, here expecting to be able to gain a few hours' time by signalling to the outer telegraph station on Point Lobos. He had caused to be painted on a sail in large black letters, "The Moonmen are back," but the officers in attendance, though their foghorn could be easily heard, the distance not being quite 2 miles, were unfortunately not able to see it. Perhaps they did see it but feared a hoax. Giving the Fort Point a good wide berth, the Susquehanna found the fog gradually clearing away, and by 3:30 the passengers, looking under it, enjoyed the glorious view of the Contra Costa Mountains east of San Francisco, which had obtained for this entrance the famous and well-deserved appellation of the Golden Gate. In another half-hour they had doubled Black Point, and were lying safely at anchor between the islands of Alcatraz and Yerba Buena. In less than 5 minutes afterwards, the captain was quickly lowered into his gig, and 8 stout pairs of arms were pulling him rapidly to shore. The usual crowd of idlers had collected that evening on the summit of Telegraph Hill to enjoy the magnificent view, which for variety, extent, beauty and grandeur is probably unsurpassed on earth. Of course, the inevitable reporter, hot after an item, was not absent. The Susquehanna had hardly crossed the bar when they caught sight of her. A government vessel entering the bay at full speed is something to look at even in San Francisco. Even during the war it would be considered rather unusual. But they soon remarked that her bowsprit was completely broken off. Very unusual. Something decidedly is the matter. See, the vessel is hardly anchored when the captain leaves her and makes for Meg's Wharf at North Point as hard as ever his men can pull. Something must be the matter, and down the steep hill they all rush as fast as ever their legs can carry them to the landing at Meg's Wharf. The captain could hardly force his way through the dense throng, but he made no attempt whatever to gratify their ill-dissembled curiosity. "Carriage," he cried, in a voice seldom heard outside the din of battle. In a moment 17 able-bodied cabmen were trying to tear him limb from limb. "To the telegraph office," like lightning, were his stifled mutterings as he struggled in the arms of the Irish giant who had at last succeeded in securing him. "To the telegraph office," cried most of the crowd, running after him like foxhounds, but the more knowing ones immediately began questioning the boatmen in the captain's gig. These honest fellows, nothing loth to tell all that they knew and more that they invented, soon had the satisfaction of finding themselves the centrepoint of a wonder-stricken audience, greedily swallowing up every item of the extraordinary news, and still hungrily gaping for more. By this time, however, an important dispatch was flying east, bearing 4 different addresses: to the Secretary of the U.S. Navy, Washington; to Colonel Joseph Wilcox, Vice President Pro Tem, Baltimore Gun Club, M.D., to J.T. Marston, Esq., Long's Peak, Grand County, Colorado, and to Professor Wenlock, Subdirector of the Cambridge Observatory, Mass. This dispatch read as follows. In latitude 27 degrees 7 minutes north and longitude 41 degrees 37 minutes west, shortly after 1 o'clock on the morning of 12th, instant Columbia projectile fell in Pacific. Send instructions. Bloomsbury. Captain Susquehanna. In 5 minutes more all San Francisco had the news. An hour later, the newspaper boys were shrieking it through the great cities of the states. Before bedtime, every man, woman, and child in the country had heard it and gone into ecstasies over it. Owing to the difference in longitude, the people of Europe could not hear it till after midnight. But next morning, the astounding issue of the great American enterprise fell on them like a thunder clap. We must, of course, decline all attempts at describing the effects of this most unexpected intelligence on the world at large. The Secretary of the Navy immediately telegraphed directions to the Susquehanna to keep a full head of steam up night and day so as to be ready to give instant execution to orders received at any moment. The observatory authorities at Cambridge held a special meeting that very evening, where, with all the serene calmness so characteristic of learned societies, they discussed the scientific points of the question in all its bearings. But before committing themselves to any decided opinion, they unanimously resolved to wait for the development of further details. At the rooms of the Gun Club in Baltimore, there was a terrible time. The kind reader no doubt remembers the nature of the dispatch sent one day previously by Professor Belfast from the Long's Peak Observatory, announcing that the projectile had been seen, but that it had become the moon's satellite, destined to revolve around her forever and ever till time should be no more. The reader is also kindly aware by this time that such dispatch was not supported by the slightest foundations in fact. The learned professor, in a moment of temporary cerebral excitation, to which even the greatest scientist is just as liable as the rest of us, had taken some little meteor, or, still more probably, some little fly-speck in the telescope for the projectile. The worst of it was that he had not only boldly proclaimed his alleged discovery to the world at large, but he had even explained all about it with the well-known easy pomposity that science sometimes ventures to assume. The consequences of all this may be readily guessed. The Baltimore Gun Club had split up immediately into two violently opposed parties. Those gentlemen who regularly conned the scientific magazines took every word of the learned professor's dispatch for gospel, or rather for something of far higher value, and more strictly in accordance with the highly advanced scientific developments of the day. But the others, who never read anything but the daily papers and who could not bear the idea of losing Barbican, laughed the whole thing to scorn. Belfast, they said, had seen as much of the projectile as he had of the open polar sea, and the rest of the dispatch was mere twaddle, though asserted with all the sternness of a religious dogma and enveloped in the usual scientific slang. The meeting held in the clubhouse, 24 Monument Square, Baltimore, on the evening of the 13th, had been therefore disorderly in the highest degree. Long before the appointed hour, the great hall was densely packed and the greatest uproar prevailed. Vice President Wilcox took the chair, and all was comparatively quiet until Colonel Bloomsbury, the honorary secretary in Marston's absence, commenced to read Belfast's dispatch. Then the scene, according to the account given in the next day's Sun, from whose columns we condense our report, actually beggared description. Roars, yells, cheers, countercheers, clappings, hissings, stampings, squallings, whistlings, barkings, mewings, cock crowings, all of the most fearful and demoniacal character, turned the immense hall into a regular pandemonium. In vain did President Wilcox fire off his detonating bell, with a report on ordinary occasions as loud as the roar of a small piece of ordnance. In the dreadful noise then prevailing it was no more heard than the fizz of a lucifer match. Some cries, however, made themselves occasionally heard in the pauses of the din. Read, read, dry up, sit down, give him an egg, fair play, hurrah for Barbican, down with his enemies, free speech, Belfast won't bite you. He'd like to bite Barbican but his teeth aren't sharp enough. Barbican's a martyr to science, let's hear his fate. Martyr be hanged, the old man is to the good yet. Belfast is the grandest name in science. Groans for the grandest name. Awful groans. 3 cheers for old man Barbican. The exceptional strength alone of the walls saved the building from being blown out by an explosion in which at least 5,000 pairs of lungs participated. 3 cheers for 1,000 Nicholl and the Frenchman. This was followed by another burst of cheering so hearty, vigorous and long, continued that the scientific party, or Belfasters as they were now called, seeing that further prolongation of the meet was perfectly useless, moved to adjourn. It was carried unanimously. President Wilcox left the chair, The meeting broke up in the wildest disorder, the scientists rather crestfallen, but the Barbican men quite jubilant for having been so successful in preventing the reading of that detested dispatch. Little sleeping was done that night in Baltimore, and less business next day. Even in the public schools, so little work was done by the children that St. Wallace, Esquire, President of the Education Board, advised an anticipation of the usual Christmas recess by a week. Every one talked of the projectile. Nothing was heard at the corners but discussions regarding its probable fate. All Baltimore was immediately rent into two parties, the Belfasters and the Barbicanites. The latter was the most enthusiastic and noisy, the former decidedly the most numerous and influential. Science, or rather pseudoscience, always exerts a mysterious attraction of an exceedingly powerful nature over the generality. That is, the more ignorant portion of the human race assert the most absurd nonsense, call it a scientific truth, and back it up with strange words which, like potentiality, etc., sound as if they had a meaning but in reality have none, and 9 out of every 10 men who read your book will believe you. Acquire a remarkable name in one branch of human knowledge and presto, you are infallible in all. Who can contradict you, if you only wrap up your assertions in specious phrases that not one man in a million attempts to ascertain the real meaning of? We like so much to be saved the trouble of thinking, that it is far easier and more comfortable to be led than to contradict, to fall in quietly with the great flock of sheep that jump blindly after their leader than to remain apart, making oneself ridiculous by foolishly attempting to argue. Real argument, in fact, is very difficult, for several reasons. First, you must understand your subject well, which is hardly likely. Secondly, your opponent must also understand it well, which is even less likely. Thirdly, you must listen patiently to his arguments, which is still less likely. And fourthly, he must listen to yours, the least likely of all. If a quack advertises a panacea for all human ills at $1 a bottle, 100 will buy the bottle. For one that will try, how many are killed by it? What would the investigator gain by charging the quack with murder? Nobody would believe him, because nobody would take the trouble to follow his arguments. His adversary, first in the field, had gained the popular ear, and remained the unassailable master of the situation. Our love of science rests upon our admiration of intellect, only unfortunately the intellect is too often that of other people, not our own. The very sound of Belfast's phrases, for instance, satellite, lunar attraction, immutable path of its orbit, etc., convinced the greater part of the intelligent community that he who used them so flippantly must be an exceedingly great man. Therefore, he had completely proved his case. Therefore, the great majority of the ladies and gentlemen that regularly attend the scientific lectures of the Peabody Institute pronounced Barbican's fate, and that of his companions, to be sealed. Next morning's newspapers contained lengthy obituary notices of the great balloonatics, as the witty man of the New York Herald phrased it, some of which might be considered quite complimentary. These all industriously copied into the evening papers. The people were carefully reading over again, some with honest regret, some deriving a great moral lesson from an attempt exceedingly reprehensible in every point of view, but most, we are sorry to acknowledge, with a feeling of ill-concealed pleasure. Had not they always said how it was to end? Was there anything more absurd ever conceived? Scientific men too, hang such science. If you want a real scientific man, no windbag, no sham, take Belfast. He knows what he's talking about, no taking him in. Didn't he, by means of the monster telescope, see the projectile as large as life whirling round and round the moon? Anyway, what else could have happened? Wasn't it what anybody's common sense expected? Don't you remember a conversation we had with you one day, etc., etc.? The Barbicanites were very doleful, but they never though of giving in. They would die sooner. When pressed for a scientific reply to a scientific argument, they denied that there was any argument to reply to. What, had not Belfast seen the projectile? No, was not the great telescope then good for anything? Yes, but not for everything. Did not Belfast know his business? No. Did they mean to say that he had seen nothing at all? Well, not exactly that, but those scientific gentlemen can seldom be trusted. In their rage for discovery, they make a mountain out of a molehill, or, what is worse, they start a theory and then distort facts to support it. Answers of this kind either led directly to a fight, or the Belfasters moved away thoroughly disgusted with the ignorance of their opponents, who could not see a chain of reasoning as bright as the noonday sun. Things were in this feverish state on the evening of the 14th, when all at once Bloomsbury's dispatch arrived in Baltimore. I need not say that it dropped like a spark in a keg of gunpowder. The first question all asked was, is it genuine or bogus, real or got up by the stockbrokers? but a few flashes backwards and forwards over the wires soon settled that point. The stunning effects of the new blow were hardly over when the Barbicanites began to perceive that the wonderful intelligence was decidedly in their favor. Was it not a distinct contradiction of the whole story told by their opponents? If Barbican and his friends were lying at the bottom of the Pacific, they were certainly not circumgirating around the moon. If it was the projectile that had broken off the bowsprit of the Susquehanna, it could not certainly be the projectile that Belfast had seen only the day previous doing the duty of a satellite. Did not the truth of one incident render the other an absolute impossibility? If Bloomsbury was right, was not Belfast an ass? Hurrah! The new revelation did not improve poor Barbican's fate a bit, no matter for that. Did not the party gain by it? What would the Belfasters say now? Would not they hold down their heads in confusion and disgrace? The Belfasters, with a versatility highly creditable to human nature, did nothing of the kind. Rapidly adopting the very line of tactics they had just been so severely censuring, they simply denied the whole thing. What the truth of the Bloomsbury dispatch? Yes, every word of it. Had not Bloomsbury seen the projectile? No, were not his eyes good for anything? Yes, but not for everything. Did not the captain know his business? No. Did they mean to say that the bowsprit of the Susquehanna had not been broken off? Well, not exactly that, but those naval gentlemen are not always to be trusted. After a pleasant little supper, they often see the wrong lighthouse, or, what is worse, in their desire to shield their negligence from censure, they dodge the blame by trying to show that the accident was unavoidable. The Susquehanna's bowsprit had been snapped off in all probability by some sudden squall, or, what was still more likely, some little aerolite had struck it and frightened the crew into fits. When answers of this kind did not lead to blows, the case was an exceptional one indeed. The contestants were so numerous and so excited that the police at last began to think of letting them fight it out without any interference. Marshal O'Kane, though ably assisted by his 12 officers and patrolmen, had a terrible time of it. The most respectable men in Baltimore, with eyes blackened, noses bleeding and collars torn, saw the inside of a prison that night for the first time in all their lives. Men that even the Great War had left the warmest of friends, now abused each other like fishwomen. The prison could not hold the half of those arrested. They were all, however, discharged next morning, for the simple reason that the mayor and the aldermen had been themselves engaged in so many pugilistic combats during the night that they were altogether disabled from attending to their magisterial duties next day. Our readers, however, may be quite assured that, even in the wildest whirl of the tremendous excitement around them, all the members of the Baltimore Gun Club did not lose their heads, in spite of the determined opposition of the Belfasters, who would not allow the Bloomsbury dispatch to be read at the special meeting called that evening. A few succeeded in adjourning to a committee room, where Joseph Wilcox-esque, presiding, our old friends Colonel Bloomsbury, Major Elphinstone, Tom Hunter, Bilsby the Brave, General Morgan, Chief Engineer John Murphy, and about as many more as were sufficient to form a quorum, declared themselves to be in regular session, and proceeded quietly to debate on the nature of Captain Bloomsbury's dispatch. Was it of a nature to justify immediate action or not? Decided unanimously in the affirmative. Why so? Because, whether actually true or untrue, the incident it announced was not impossible. Had it indeed announced the projectile to have fallen in California or in South America, there would have been good valid reasons to question its accuracy. But by taking into consideration the moon's distance, and the time elapsed between the moment of the start and that of the presumed fall, about 10 days, and also the Earth's revolution in the meantime, it was soon calculated that the point at which the projectile should strike our globe, if it struck it at all, would be somewhere about 27 degrees north latitude and degrees west longitude, the very identical spot given in the captain's dispatch. This certainly was a strong point in its favor, especially as there was positively nothing valid whatever to urge against it. A decided resolution was therefore immediately taken. Everything that man could do was to be done at once, in order to fish up their brave associates from the depths of the Pacific. That very night, in fact, whilst the streets of Baltimore were still resounding with the yells of contending Belfasters and Barbicanites, a committee of 4, Morgan, Hunter, Murphy and Elphinstone, were speeding over the Alleghanies in a special train, placed at their disposal by the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad Company, and fast enough to land them in Chicago pretty early on the following evening.